We've been fighting a long time, and we have all lost so very much, so many loved ones gone. But you are not alone. There are pockets of resistance all around the planet. We are at the brink. You have no idea how important you are. If you're listening to this, you are the resistance.
Ave Maria Stella Dei Mater Alma atque semper virgo Felix te porta.
We've been fighting a long time, and we have all lost so very much, so many loved ones gone. But you are not alone. There are pockets of resistance all around the planet. We are at the brink. You have no idea how important you are. If you're listening to this, you are the resistance.
Ave Maria Stella Dei Mater Alma atque semper virgo Felix te porta.
Well, welcome once again to our Wednesday night Zoom presentations for the parish. And once again, we're going to have part 2 of homeopathy, that particular topic, as well as a vaccine update. So let's begin with an introduction before we introduce Pam Acker again to discuss this important topic. At the age of 31 years old, the great Augustine of Hippo was already the professor of rhetoric in the great court in Milan, Italy, a very prestigious position to say the least. He was highly respected and had a promising career ahead of him, but at that particular point, he was living in agony because the intellectual world he had occupied was collapsing. And on top of this, Augustine had given himself over to all kinds of bad behavior, licentious behavior. Augustine became more attracted, though, to the truths of Christianity. But because he was in bondage to his sensual pleasures, he was again in agony. He went out behind his house and into a garden where he could sit in the grass under a tree. And as he sat there, he became very agitated. He finally got up and went over to a fig tree and fell down on his knees, weeping uncontrollably. In his book called The Confessions, he said that he began to cry out using the words of Psalm 13, "How long, O Lord?" Augustine prayed like that, and he received an unusual answer. As he cried out to the Lord, he heard a little voice, like a child's sort of sing-song voice. He later said, quote, "I don't know if it was a boy or a girl, but it was clearly children." That was the voice he heard. And they were singing this little phrase, "Tolle legge, tolle legge." That's Latin for take up and read. Read the scriptures, the Bible, the inerrant word of God. When Augustine heard that command, tolle legge, take up and read, he heard it was God's speaking to him. Augustine opened the Bible and his eyes fell upon St. Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 13, quote, "Let us walk properly as in the daytime, not in orgies and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and sensuality, not in quarreling and jealousy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to gratify its desires," unquote. Take up and read. And Augustine was further and further converted to the faith. Wisdom was ever more flowing into him. During our presentation last week, our guest, Pam Acker, told us a little about the founder of homeopathy, namely Samuel Hahnemann. Although brought up in a Protestant household, he became a religious free thinker, believing that God permeated every living thing. He was also, as Pam told us, a Freemason, with an affinity, as most of them have, towards the esoteric and the occult. In connection with homeopathy, Hahnemann seems to have believed that he was divinely chosen and guided in his work. He made it clear that he believed that his new doctrine of homeopathy was inspired by God. Hahnemann considered the succussion, that is sort of banging and shaking violently, in the course of making homeopathic dilutions was most effective when fluid containers were banged on a leather-bound book, preferably, he said, a leather-bound Bible. Instead of taking up and reading the sacred scriptures, Hahnemann would suggest banging, striking vigorously, and concussing the homeopathic dilutions and containers against a leather-bound Bible. To end this introduction, in my cursory look at the topic, of course, Pam has looked at this quite extensively, but in my short look at this topic, I've noted a few things that are most concerning. First of all, homeopathy claims to be an alternative to big pharma, big pharmacies, right? And yet it is big pharma. It's a $15 billion industry. As for the notion of multiple dilutions to a point that little or no presence of the healing element is present in the solution, sort of like dropping an aspirin into the Atlantic Ocean, then drinking a glass from that ocean in order to cure a headache, or the ritualistic vigorous shaking and concussing, which supposedly energizes the mixture, or the notion of water memory, where H2O has been imprinted, if you will, with a recollection, an impression of the original ingredient, though no element of that original remedy remains in the water. This is not about chemistry or medicine, it seems, but rather supposed spiritual energies. And perhaps we could call it magic. Many believe it works. Even some skeptics believe it works, but they have no idea why. Last week, we discussed the fact that it may work due to occult influences in some cases. But there are other answers too that we will discuss this evening, including the placebo effect, or simply healing coming through more natural living, better living, healthier living, or just giving the body time to heal. Okay, so last time you talked about Samuel Hahnemann and the founder of homeopathy,
Right.
and perhaps some of his sort of background is maybe being a contributing factor to why we should be maybe a bit more cautious about this particular means of healing. So maybe you could talk about sort of the actual science regarding homeopathy, or lack of science that is present in this.
Sure. Yeah, the guidelines that I was given for investigating alternative therapies is basically like you look into the origin and then you look into how it works, and if the origin is occult, that's a problem. If you can't figure out how it works, that's also a problem. If both go together, it's a double problem. And so we're looking at that double problem, unfortunately, with homeopathy. So just to kind of quickly recap the nature of homeopathy before we just kind of dive into some of the science. We talked last time about the medicines being verified by provings. So this is when people would take the medications and see, what kind of symptoms they developed. And it resulted in these kind of ridiculously long catalogs of symptoms for any given remedy. And it also led to what I would call an over-reliance on mental symptoms. So things like how you're feeling, whether you're anxious or whether you're disgruntled or whether you're feeling kind of loss or grief or something like that. And it also led to people treating things like loss and grief through homeopathic remedies, which is I think inappropriate. Grief is not a physiological thing that you need to cure. You also have the principle in homeopathy of like curing like, and we'll talk about that in a minute, because there's been some things that people compare homeopathy to that I want to kind of take a look at, and one of them actually is vaccination, interestingly. So it's curious because most people who advocate homeopathy are very opposed to vaccination, but then some people justify it by saying it's very much like vaccination because you're exposing, yourself to a disease in order to protect yourself from a disease, kind of thing. The other thing you talked a little bit about, the smaller doses being better. So the more dilute it is, the better it's thought to work. And we talked last time about kind of exceeding Avogadro's limit to the point where there's no molecules left in these substances. And you can think of a 30C dilution, which is kind of a standard homeopathic formulation, as if you had a sphere of water the size of roughly the distance from the sun to the earth, which is a bigger distance than any of us can really quantify. So sphere of water with that diameter, you would and you put one molecule of a substance into that sphere of water, you would have a 30.89C dilution. So we're talking extremely, 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 extremely dilute, to the point that really, truly, there are no molecules left. Although, as we'll see as we go through this, some homeopaths try to argue that there are molecules left, whilst arguing that there aren't molecules left. So it's an interesting...
At least the memory of those molecules.
Right.
The time they spent together. The time that they spent
Well,
together.
no, some of them do actually argue that molecules are left. It's really quite interesting. I won't give it away too much, but there was this experiment done on metal ions that suggested that you can't dilute them past a certain point. At that point, everything just sort of, they use the word levitate. It levitates to the surface, and then it remains in the suspension. I don't know why they didn't just use the word float. That would have been a more normal, like, scientific word. So the other thing we talked about is succession. So you have to beat the dilution after you make it. And Hahnemann himself basically insisted that it's not just diluting the medicine, but the actual process of shaking it and mixing it and striking it against leather at a particular number of times that allows the drug to be dynamized or potentized. So that's what gives it its actual healing remedies. And people in traditional schools of homeopathy would agree with him. There's some division in terms of homeopathic schools. There's some who try to be a little bit more scientific about it, and they go into things like the memory of water and things like that, and try to put some sort of chemical or physical veneer on it. But Hahnemann himself, talked about the remedy being dynamized so it could act spiritually upon the vital forces of the body. So he wasn't, unclear about what his tenets were. And then finally, homeopathy, which is, I think this is why it appeals to so many people. They claim that it seeks to treat the person rather than treating the disease. And so it's very holistic. But as you quoted last time from the document, Jesus Christ, the Bearer of the Water of Life, that document actually talks about the word holistic in terms of health. And we have to be very careful with this idea of holism, because it's kind of rooted in or connected to what they termed the Gaia hypothesis, which is actually a form of pantheism, that sort of everything is kind of interconnected in this giant organism. And so you do have to have an understanding of, when you're treating an ailment in the body, you have to treat the whole body. And I have direct experience of this, because I've had doctors try to treat my ankle and ignore the rest of me. And that's led to some severe skeletal muscular problems. So you do have to treat the person as a whole person. And you can't really expect that the circulatory, if you do something in the circulatory system, it's not going to have effects on other systems. Or, for example, in vaccination, if you do something to the immune system, that's going to dramatically affect your entire body, your whole health. And so, it's not wrong to want to seek to treat the whole of the person by any means, but we have to be very careful about, understanding holism and what that means in terms of, like, a whole individual, rather than the individual sort of being absorbed into this pantheistic whole. And it's not really clear sometimes, unfortunately, where medical practitioners fall on that spectrum.
And just before you begin,
sure,
you would be a big promoter of a natural sort of pathic sort of treating the human person, where the natural remedies which are present in creation that the good Lord gave us there's plenty of good things out there that have agency that could bring about a cure or remedy. So you're not like this sort of, I'm only into, artificial big pharma medicine.
No, of course not. No, no,
Natural.
no. Yeah, no, I'm a huge advocate of vitamin D and vitamin C, which are actually necessary things that your body needs. And there's been a lot of work done that's really demonstrated that I think it really effectively demonstrated that the recommended daily allowance of vitamin C is just way too low to be really effective in a human body. If you look at animals that actually make their own vitamin C, especially when they're sick or they're under stress, they're making massive amounts, like grams per kilogram, the recommended daily allowance is something mediocre, like 180 milligrams or something like that. And you can I have taken, multiple grams of vitamin C without any negative effect. And Dr. Suzanne Humphreys has a much better, talk on that than I could possibly give. So I'll refer people to her. But yeah, there's a lot of natural substances. Even you were talking about, there's I don't know the name of it, but a specific plant that acts as a natural remedy to poison ivy. And they often grow kind of in the same place. And there's elderberry extracts are supposed to boost your immune system. I mean, there's all kinds of things that could just sort of rattle off that I make use of on a regular occasion. Even honey for allergies, although people argue about whether that's legit or not. And I'm not in any way, shape, or form arguing that antibiotics and vaccinations are the saviors of mankind, as we know. So. And definitely, even we talked a little bit about allopathy, in the last installment of this, and I mentioned fever. So the homeopath would want to, do something that would sort of correspond with the fever, and the allopath would want to suppress the fever. I'm not even a fan of suppressing fevers. I will take ibuprofen if I'm, in a lot of pain with my ankle and everything. But I don't think that fever suppression is a good idea. I think that's a natural, bodily mechanism that's designed to help clear, bad stuff out of your body, to clear pathogens out of your body. So yeah, I'm not sitting here explaining my objections to homeopathy because I'm I'm a paid arm of Pfizer or something like that.
Sure, yeah. So homeopathy now. So tell us some of the things that you've read about in terms of like the placebo effect and things like that.
Sure. Sorry, that's my quail. My animals keep interrupting our conversations here, Father. Okay, so the placebo effect is really very interesting, but some of these explanations about homeopathy is supposed to work if it's not the placebo effect are also quite interesting. I can start with either one. Do you have a preference, Father? Do you want me to start at the placebo effect, or
you start whatever is best order-wise for you?
Okay. I think I'll start with the things that homeopathy is like, because that is often the arguments that I'll encounter personally, or people will make kind of in some of the literature that I've been reading. So sometimes people will argue that homeopathy works. It's just like anti-venom. So you're giving a little bit of the venom of the snake to cure a snake bite, but that's actually not how anti-venom works. Anti-venom is actually when the venom is given to an animal, generally speaking, and that animal then produces antibodies to the venom. So it is actually something that's anti the venom, and that antibody is then injected into a human to protect them from a snake bite. So technically, you have the venom at the beginning of the chain protecting from the venom at the end of the chain, but you have this seroconversion that happens in the middle, where an animal's body actually takes it doesn't even take the venom and convert it into something. It actually responds to the venom, produces a molecule that binds to the venom, neutralizes the venom, and can actually keep you as a human being from dying if you're bitten by that snake. So anti-venom is really not like homeopathy at all, because you're not using the snake venom to cure the snake venom. actually using antibodies for the snake venom. Sometimes people have said that homeopathy is like vaccination, because you're taking a very weakened form of a disease or a virus that's causing disease, and you're injecting that in the body, and then your body is now going to be able to fight that disease correctly. But there's a couple of reasons why that's not really a very good analogy, and one of which is there's actual molecules in the vaccine. There's in the COVID vaccines, there's actual mRNA or DNA with the viral vector vaccines, or in regular vaccines, there's actual molecules from the pathogen. So you're actually injecting something into the body that has like a legitimate pharmacological response that's going to happen, and then that response is primarily in your immune system, which is not what homeopathy necessarily claims to affect. Some homeopathic remedies are supposed to affect other systems, so it's not a super great analogy. Another one I hear a lot is hormones. Well, hormones are super dilute, and specifically somebody claimed, well, if you take 1 milligram of acetylcholine and you dissolve that in 500,000 gallons of water, and you take a little bit of that, you can lower a cat's blood pressure. And that I worked it out because, water has a density of 1 gram per milliliter. So, then 50,000 gallons of water is approximately 2 billion milliliters. It's about 1.87 billion, but we'll just say 2 billion.
Round it up. Yeah.
Round it up. Well, but it's easier than saying 1.87 repeatedly. So that's a 1 in 2 billion dilution. Now, I did the quick math. Now, it's really funny. So now anytime I have students complain in my science classes about doing unit conversions and say, when am I going to use this in real life? I'm going to say, when you're talking to your pastor about homeopathy. Because I did. I used unit conversions in real life. And I calculated, based on the density or the grams per mole of acetylcholine, how many molecules would be in a drop of acetylcholine, and then if I diluted that 1 to 2 billion, how many molecules would be in 1 drop of blood. And in 1 drop of blood at a 1 to 2 billion dilution, there'd be approximately 100 million molecules of acetylcholine. So that's very different from 0 molecules. It's a very dilute solution, but there's still a lot of molecules. And everything that I know about signaling biology, and having studied this in grad school and all that, that the response to hormones works on a biochemical gradient. So like the more that I have, the more response I'm going to get. So it'll depend on, where things are at in the body and how, because you'll have higher concentrations in particular areas when you have sort of localized signaling. When you have hormone signaling, it'll be a little bit more distributed evenly throughout your circulatory system. But still, the 100 million molecules in a drop of blood is a lot of molecules that's going to drive biological effects in a very different way than something that has no molecules of the original substance. So it's really not a good analogy at all. And allergies, again, not a good analogy for the same reason. You have a really violent response to a really small amount of something, but again, it's a small amount of something, and something is very different from nothing. I don't remember if it was in Foundations Restored or your father recently mentioned the ridiculousness of Stephen Hawking saying, that nothing is so close to something that at some point something just jumped out of nothing. It's like, you can't really say that. Like, nothing and something are diametrically opposed. So even a very little amount of something is very, very different than nothing. And then the last kind of thing that people will say, well, why does it matter if we know how homeopathy works? Because we don't know how anesthesia works, but we use anesthesia all the time. I happily accepted anesthesia when they took my wisdom teeth out. I did not want to be awake for that. But anesthesia works. Even if we don't know exactly how it works in the body, or why that we can put you to sleep and wake you up, we know how to put you to sleep and we know how to wake you up. And if, we really just basically need to know a little bit about you. We need to know, your weight and your, maybe your age and some underlying complications. We don't need to know, as, sometimes it seems like in homeopathy, we don't need to know your zodiac sign or, whether you're more likely to get angry or sad if somebody, insults you, or there's some of these things are just so strange when you look in the Materia Medica at all the different symptoms that, are supposed to go along with these particular remedies. We just need to know some very basic things about you that are standardizable to any individual. And then we know what dose of anesthesia to give you to put you to sleep and to wake you up. And people do this very effectively all day long. I actually worked for a nurse anesthetist. He put people to sleep all day, every day, never lost a patient because it works the same way all the time. So again, very unlike homeopathy. Like last week, we talked about people having constitutional remedies, and we'll talk a little bit more this week about things working sometimes and sometimes not. Okay. I'm going to take a drink.
I was going to say we were talking about it earlier this afternoon, the individual sort of person, and how important it is to homeopathy. And so I remember one patient asking the homeopathic practitioner, I need a cure for an ear infection. And the homeopathic practitioner said, which ear, right or left? Well, I guess that considering all sort of potential aspects of the whole person there.
Yeah, I had read something about that. And I think the justification had something to do with like, well, your heart is shifted to slightly one side, so it creates this kind of like micro environment. And I mean, and back to natural remedies, I'm not sure for ear infections, but definitely for clogged ears, hydrogen peroxide is very helpful with that. And garlic oil, people have used that for a really long time for ear infections. It works in both ears. And there's actual garlic in the garlic oil, so oddly enough. Yeah. So
garlic, perhaps.
So what's that?
The memory of garlic in the oil, or actual garlic?
Actual garlic. Actual molecules. I mean, don't put like chunks of garlic in your ear. That's probably a bad idea. But things that are soluble in the oil that you extract out of the garlic. Right. This is going to turn into the messy. Don't try these, natural remedies at home. It's
right. The placebo effect.
Okay. Yes, you're very, very interested in the placebo effect, Father. So we'll go through that. Right. So one of the things that people talk about with homeopathy is, well, it works, and we talked about, well, how does it work? And there's multiple different mechanisms whereby it works and or could work. And one of them is the placebo effect. And so this is a really truly interesting phenomenon. And, it would be kind of the height of a waste of taxpayer dollars to give people different kinds of placebos and compare the results to each other to see, if the placebo effect varies. But there's a researcher who's actually he pooled data from all kinds of different trials that had placebos. So, you'll give somebody an actual drug and compare it to something that isn't an actual drug to see if the actual drug is working or not. And homeopathy has actually been tested this way as well. And I'll talk about those trials in just a second. But the placebo, for those who aren't familiar, is like it's like a placeholder. So they'll give you a little red pill, and you don't know whether that little red pill is actual medicine or it's just sugar or something like that. In the case of an injection, the placebo would be saline rather than sugar. So but generally something that's considered to be an inert substance. So it's kind of the gold standard for placebos in vaccine development is saline solution. So we'd inject you with salt water rather than injecting you with active components of the vaccine. And that's actually, to their credit, that's actually what Pfizer did. They used a true saline placebo in their experiments. They removed their control group by vaccinating them several months later, which is not good science either. But they did have an actual placebo. So you would think that this salt water would have no effect. But curiously enough, it does. Some people report side effects, that vaguely resembles the same side effects that you get in the vaccine. And that's why, if you see something that says it's no different from placebo, then whatever random effects that you observe with the placebo group, you also observe with the group that's actually receiving the medication. So this gentleman pooled all this data from all these different placebo trials, and he actually discovered some really odd things. One of which is that if you get 4 placebo pills, they work better than 2 placebo pills. So people had a higher rate of having like an actual positive resolution to their problem if they were given 4 pills versus 2 pills. They also have a higher rate, and particularly a lot of this stuff was done in looking at pain medications. So like, did you have actual pain reduction? And pain, of course, is pretty subjective. So you can experience pain but not really notice that you're experiencing pain. I get this a lot because my ankle still bothers me pretty much every day. But if I'm doing something that's very like absorbing or distracting, like preparing for a talk on homeopathy, I don't really notice that my ankle's hurting all day. But if I'm just sort of sitting around, with nothing really to do, I'm like, oh hey, my ankle's hurting right now. And I can get very myopic about it. So pain can be subjective. You can kind of be distracted from your pain, but you can also apparently your pain can be lessened by the expectation that it's going to be lessened. So one of the curious things about the placebo effect is probably everybody listening has heard of Valium, and it's a very powerful painkiller, but there was a study that showed that it doesn't actually work unless you tell the person you're administering it. Yeah, so they administered it to people while telling them and without telling them, and the people that they told that they were getting Valium, they reported that their pain had lessened, and the people that weren't told that they were getting Valium did not report any lessening of their pain. So there's this really interesting phenomenon of our expectations somehow influencing our physiology, and they've observed this even too with in terms of placebo diagnoses. So people will come in with a health complaint, not really know what is wrong. They'll be given a sham diagnosis. You have this, you can expect it to clear up in a couple of weeks. And, shockingly, in that group of people, more often the disease clears up in a couple of weeks than people who are not told that, who are told instead, we don't really know what's wrong with you. Come back in 2 weeks, So there's this really, pretty well documented effect of even just words on people. And certainly with homeopathic diagnosis, if you're seeing an actual homeopath, you end up with a lot of conversation, and there can be some sort of therapeutic aspects to that. We're all familiar with bedside manner and doctors, and it is actually a legit phenomenon that if the doctor has a better bedside manner, his patients tend to get better faster. Why? It's probably not the memory of the vibrations of the words that the air is holding on to, or something like that. It's probably sort of a lot more reasonably explicable phenomenon. One very simple thing that's been suggested is when you have a positive experience, your brain releases different neurotransmitters than when you're not having a positive experience. And so if you're releasing those positive neurotransmitters, they do actually lessen your experience of pain. So there's been some documentation of a physiological sort of cause here that's pretty plausible. But the most remarkable placebo effect story I ran across was some cleaning ladies were divided into 2 groups, and half of them were told that the cleaning that you're doing is very good exercise. It meets the FDA recommendations for how much exercise you should be getting, and you really should expect to see some improvements in health. And shockingly, as they followed these 2 groups of women, the women who'd been told how good this normal activity that they were already doing was for them, and the women who were still doing their normal activity but had not been told this, the women who'd been told that the exercise was good for them, without doing any more exercise, actually lost weight, and their waist to hip ratio decreased, and their body mass index decreased. So placebo effect does some really, really, really weird things. And so I think sometimes when we're seeing effects from homeopathic remedies, it's very possible we're seeing placebo effect, because often homeopathic remedies are given, like I said last time, for things that resolve pretty well on their own or are pain related. I think some of the most popular homeopathic remedies are things like arnica for pain, or belladonna for pain. Sorry about the bird again.
That's okay. And by the way, just to let people know,
one of the other parishioners for the bird.
So remember, like last week, Pam was able to discuss Dr. Samuel Hahnemann, who the sort of founder of homeopathy. and the occult background of, in some cases, of his Freemasonry and so forth. Because what we're trying to show here is that homeopathy, in a sense, works. Okay, so, but if there's really no medical explanation for it, why is it? And so last week we talked about the occult being perhaps an option to think about, but now we're thinking about placebo effect, because, you know, it works in some cases, and it works so well. I was talking to Pam earlier this afternoon, and in France is a major first world country. 40% of physicians are also equipped and sort of trained in homeopathic sort of treatments. 40%. So this is very present as a practice, especially in Europe. And I guess it's probably growing over here in the United States as well, I would imagine. So, because, you know, it works. So continue on there with the placebo effect, or other ways that perhaps we can answer why
Sure.
homeopathic remedies sort of work, quote unquote.
Right. Yeah, I'm talking a little bit more about the placebo effect, because there's been a lot of clinical trials that have been done on homeopathic remedies, comparing them to placebos. And, you know, I actually was forwarded an article from Mercola.com that I looked into all the footnotes of, and it was unfortunately a pretty ignorant is probably the best word, article. This person just kind of took claims and spun them to be as positive for homeopathy as absolutely possible. And unfortunately, I found that several times now with Merkel. I'm a little bit disappointed in the quality of the stuff that they publish. You really have to have a very discerning eye to it, and actually look at the original research papers that are there. But they cited a paper, and this article is from 2018, so not that long ago, but they cited a 2014 report, and it was basically hailed in this article on Mercola.com as confirming that there was a difference between homeopathic treatment and a placebo. And it was one of these meta-analyses, and a meta-analysis is when you take all kinds of different studies and you sort of pool all the results together, and it gives you more statistical power to detect real differences, because you have a greater N value. And the N value is just the number of participants in the study. So if you have 10 studies that each have 40 patients and you put them all together, now you have 400 patients, and you can look at that study kind of in or those studies in the aggregate and see if there's any difference. But there's some important things that kind of have to be done when you're doing a meta-analysis, and you can't be comparing apples to oranges, and you also can't be comparing apples to nothing, because again, nothing is really nothing. But in this particular study from 2014, they looked at 32 eligible randomized controlled trials, and randomization in a trial is it's very important, because if you don't properly randomize your trial, you're likely to, again, they've done studies on this, because, you know, why not? We'll just do study on everything. That trials with bad randomization methods exaggerate their benefits by approximately 41%. That would end up giving you a statistically significant benefit where none actually existed. And trials that don't list the randomization methods on average exaggerate their positive results by about 30%. And this is when compared against, you know, trials that I think are repeated, or just actual data, you know, once the drug gets into the real life, into the real market, as all the Pfizer or the COVID vaccines are now. So it's not really, you know, we think about randomizing, you know, your first thought might be like, well, you know, the first person that comes in, I'll put them in the control group, so they get the placebo, and the second person that comes in, I'll put them in the experimental group, and then control group, experimental group, control group, experimental group, and that's random, right? Well, that's actually not a very good way to randomize things, because, you know, as people are signing up for a study, you know, say I'm the researcher sitting here, and the next person is going to go into the experimental group, but I'm pro homeopathy, and this person comes in and is clearly like hardcore, like, I am not convinced. I am, you know, I'm just signing up for this study for the reimbursement that you guys are going to give me, and, you know, I really don't think this is going to work. I might decide, actually, you know, this person's not qualified for this study for like X, Y, or Z reason. You know, I might actually look harder for a reason to disqualify them than I would if they were going to go into the control group, and then just be like, okay, you know, you can jump into the control group. So you can get like unconscious researcher bias if you're not randomizing your trials correctly. And if you have that bias, then you end up with exaggerated placebo effects, and that's really what you're observing. So this 2014 study that looked at these 32 eligible random controlled trials, that studied 24 different medical conditions in total. They classed 12 trials as having an uncertain risk of bias. So they weren't sure like what level of the risk of bias was, probably because they didn't report their methods, which would indicate that, you know, on average, they'd be 30% too positive about the results. 3 of these 32 studies displayed relatively minor uncertainty and were designated reliable evidence, and 20 trials were classed high risk of bias. And then they took 22 of the trials that had extractable data and they subjected them to meta-analysis. And as a person who has sat in research discussions with other people who have argued vociferously about methods and like, I don't think that your interpretation of your data is correct because XYZ reason, and they actually usually have a pretty compelling, you know, scientists don't nitpick at each other about like nothing, you know, especially if they're in the same field. The fact that they took 22 trials when only 3 of them were designated as having reliable evidence tells me that this study is absolute bunk. It's ridiculous, because at most, at the best possible thing they could have done is that 15 of those 22 trials had either reliable evidence or uncertain evidence, and then the rest of them had high risk of bias evidence. And that's only if all 3 of the good trials had extractable data and all 12 of the uncertain trials had extractable data, which we don't even know. So this is a horrendously bad study. And even though the article in Mercola said that it confirmed that there's a difference between homeopathic treatment and a placebo, the report itself said this, and I quote, "Medicines prescribed in individualized homeopathy may have small, specific treatment effects. Findings are consistent with subgroup data available in a previous global systematic review. The low or unclear overall quality of the evidence prompts caution in interpreting the findings. New high-quality randomized controlled trial research is necessary to enable more decisive interpretation." The article said our data is too bad for us to really like say, except that it sort of looks positive. Like,
Right.
that, and you know, if that's the best that people can come up with, that's really sad. I'm sorry. And clinical trials can be manipulated, and Ben Goldacre wrote like an entire book called Bad Pharma, which talks about this in great detail, which I highly recommend as a very entertaining read, and just very enlightening if you've like never looked into clinical research before. But this is like ridiculous. Even for, you know, potentially bad clinical research, because of course no clinical research is going to be perfect, but there are things you can do to make it better, and this is just silly. So, you know, going back a little further to 1996, there was a report that was done by the Homeopathic Medicine Research Group, which included some homeopathic physicians and researchers, as well as experts in clinical research, and they examined 184 papers, so it's a much larger sample size. They concluded that only 17 of these were designed and reported well enough to have any merit worth examining, and that the number of participants in these 17 trials was too small to draw any conclusion about the effectiveness of homeopathic treatment for any specific condition. So they were at least honest about the fact that, you know, you can't really measure results for one condition against another condition and say, well, homeopathy works, you know, kind of across the board based on, you know, a couple of potential things for specific conditions. And, you know, when you're looking at you know, trials, obviously the larger the sample size, the greater the cost. So there's a limit to how robust you can make your sample that way. But there's no cost to randomizing properly, and there's no cost to blinding properly. And this is another big problem with clinical trials and alternative medicine in general, but also homeopathy in particular, is that the double blind studies are the best, where the participant doesn't know what they're receiving. So you can't have that power of suggestion of like if you know that you're receiving the actual medicine, or you know that you're receiving the actual placebo, then you know there's a subconscious, you know, bias towards noticing or not noticing certain things that may or may not be attached to the medicine. So, you know, as the individual receiving it, you have to not know which one you're receiving. But as the researcher administering it, you also have to not know which one you're administering. if studies aren't properly blinded, especially in alternative health, what you tend to see is if they are blinded, there's no significant benefit. If they're not blinded or unblinded, then you'll see a massive significant benefit for whatever alternative health therapy is being tested. So this is a huge problem when looking at studies done that purportedly show the benefits of homeopathy. You really have to look into the materials and methods. How did they randomize their participants? Did they double blind? How many people are they testing? Exactly what are they testing? How are they tabulating their data? How many people did they have in their study? My research methods kids could run you through all of this probably. All of these different things that you have to pay attention to in order to actually trust the results of a study. So you can't just like point to one publication, even one meta-analysis of publications and say, look, homeopathy works. You have to look behind the curtain. And that's what I've spent the last couple of weeks doing. And I've read some really wonky stuff about water memory.
You know what? I want to talk about water memory. So, so again, the placebo effect you mentioned a little bit, and obviously we talked about issues regarding just time. I mean, instead of bloodletting, let's say, centuries past, just let the body heal itself, and it's not necessarily attributable to homeopathic remedies, but just time, the body healing itself. Or we talked about too the notion that you have the expectation, at least in the past, that a person taking homeopathic remedies would clean up their life a bit. They would get more fresh air. You may cut out coffee and tea and maybe alcohol, and they would try to get better exercise. And so there's lots of potential reasons why a person might have been healed besides the homeopathic remedy, especially when there's little or no presence of any molecules of the original ingredients in. So this brings us to water memory. Right. What is this water memory thing?
Well, it's interesting because that same Merkel article I referenced, in the same article, it argued both that, you don't need to, in fact, it's silly to talk about chemically examining homeopathic remedies because it's not about the chemicals. And then later in the article, it's arguing, oh, actually, like there are still molecules left in these homeopathic dilutions. So it's just arguing like both sides of the coin at the same time, which is just like, again, such bad science. But if there truly are no molecules left, then you have to posit another mechanism for how is there somehow information being retained in this remedy. And so water memory is kind of one of the ones I've seen more often. And water is an extremely unique molecule. Life would not exist without the unique properties of water. So for example, water will float when it freezes rather than sinking. Most things are more dense as solids than liquids. So if water did that, the oceans would freeze from the bottom up and it would only ever kind of melt on the top, and you simply wouldn't be able to have life in a body of water. There's all kinds of the high heat of vaporization, high specific heat that has to do with high heat of vaporization is how, sweating can cool you down. So the water evaporating off of you requires a lot of heat that takes a lot of heat out of your body so that you don't overheat. The high specific heat of water keeps coastal areas, cooler in the summer and warmer in the winter because, the water acts as like heat sink. This is why, when you want to jump in the water as soon as it seems like the first day of spring, it's a really bad idea because the air has warmed up, but the water has not. Right. So water does have some very unique properties. And when you put it under extreme situations like extreme pressures or extreme temperatures, it can do some really, really strange behaving things. And I actually spent, as part of my research, I spent a good long, close to an hour on the phone with my brother, who is a coastal engineer, and he spent a number of years studying fluid dynamics in graduate school. So he knows a lot about water and how water works and how water behaves under particular conditions. And, so it's not just my own, expertise in immunology and cell biology I'm applying here. I'm also sort of importing the familial science gene and talking about fluid dynamics too. So he and I talked a lot about this, and then I read a lot about this, and water does some very interesting things, and that kind of opened the door to some of these theories, but the theories themselves, if you'll pardon the pun, don't hold water. So let's look at a couple of them. So one of the main guys who just comes up again and again and again is Jacques Beneviste. And he did an experiment and it was published in Nature, which is a hugely important journal, in 1988. And he took some extremely dilute solutions of antibodies, and he saw that these extremely dilute solutions of antibodies caused a physiological effect, and this generated like the same sort of fever that cold fusion did. It was just like, how could this be true? Everybody kind of jumped on the board to try to replicate his results. And Nature published his results on the condition that these other labs around the world would try to replicate what he had done, and it turns out that none of them were actually able to replicate what he did. And actually, when people the head, this was kind of a extraordinary thing, the head editor of Nature, along with two other witnesses, one of whom was I think a scientific journalist, and the other who was actually a professional magician. I guess they were trying to make sure that nobody was pulling any magic tricks. They had Beneviste reconduct his own experiments in his own laboratory, and he couldn't generate the same data. And so his paper was never retracted, but it was seriously discredited. And people who claim that it wasn't are reading a lot of homeopathy reviews and not a lot of actual science. Because I read through a number of the responses to his paper in Nature that were published before his work was even tried to be replicated. And it was interesting to see how sort of effusive and general and vague some of the pro-homeopathy responses were, and how the regular scientists were primarily asking like legitimate questions about his methods, and one of them pointed out that the experiment demonstrated a really strange periodicity, that it was probably an artifact of the way that the microwell plates were filled. Because if you're working at such high dilutions, if you have even like the tiniest fraction of like micro spray coming off of your equipment as you're filling these wells, which are right next to each other, you would see that every well in this row or next to this particular well that had the higher concentration would see a higher effect. And so there were some really reasonable, very, very reasonable criticisms that were offered, that were published in Nature about not even a year after his original paper was published, a few months after his paper was published. Unfortunately, I don't think this experiment really demonstrates anything about water having a memory in the way that homeopaths would need it to, even though there was a lady by the name of Madeline Ennis who tried a slightly different experiment and got similar results, and she was working with some homeopathic companies. She herself was a complete skeptic, but she was working with some homeopathic companies, and she used some really dilute solutions of histamine, and her first experiment had a positive result. It looked like the actual histamine and the dilute histamine had the same effect. But then she also tried to replicate her results. She was able to replicate them one time, but not replicate them a second time. And at that point, it was they kind of figured out that the ambient conditions of the laboratory actually influenced the cellular response that they were looking at. And so if you did the experiment in certain ways, you could get the results, but if you did it in other ways, you couldn't get the results. And so the outcome they were looking for, which we would call the dependent variable, was highly influenced by environment. And her original result, from what I read, I was unfortunately only able to find a secondary source on this, not a primary source, but it looked like it lacked what we would call a negative control. So they had a positive control. They put actual histamine in with the cells to see what they would do in the presence of actual histamine, but it doesn't look like they put in just plain water that hadn't been homeopathically prepared to see what would happen if there was no water. At least that wasn't reported in the literature that I read. And if they didn't actually do that, that was a badly designed experiment. And that would have, potentially made it invalid, because then if you're seeing the response in both the cells that are treated with the histamine and the cells that are treated with the homeopathic histamine, the one that's diluted out of existence, and you see both the cells respond the same way, it could just be due to something in the environment that you're not taking into account. So, and actually, even if you had a negative control, you might still have that problem. So that might not have helped. So never mind.
I just wanted to, to remind people of why we're talking about this notion of water sort of reminiscing, having a certain memory, because if there is, as a part of homeopathic practice, multiple dilutions, as Pam so well said, to the point that the ingredient that you originally put in there, it's no longer there. It's not present. And so the notion is that somehow some impression or imprinting, spiritually perhaps, of that ingredient has come into the water and therefore has perhaps changed its structure, that it sort of carries on that sort of presence in some way, energized presence of that particular ingredient. But of course, as Pam said to me today, since oftentimes these particular homeopathic medicines are taken via a pill, like a sugar-like pill, that when you spray this solution, which is water for the most part, with actually no presence of any real ingredient, the water is going to evaporate. So as Pam rightly said to me this afternoon, she said, well, then sugar also must have recollection.
Right. You have to talk about sugar memory, not just water memory, if you're going to posit this is how homeopathy works. Yeah,
so
because you don't.
More about
Sure. So there was a second fellow. His name was Luc Montaigne, something like that. It's French, and I know I'm butchering it. I wrote down somewhere how to pronounce it, but it's on my kitchen table. But he looked at some bacterial DNA sequences, and he claimed that these can induce electromagnetic waves when they're highly diluted. And there's some kind of, he said, so this is his quoting directly from the abstract of his article. It appears to be a resonance phenomenon which is triggered by the ambient electromagnetic background of very low frequency waves. The genomic DNA of most pathogenic bacteria contains sequences which are able to generate such signals. This opens the way to the development of highly sensitive detection system for chronic bacterial infections in human and animal diseases. So this was like kind of the reincarnation of water memory, if you will, after Beneviste was somewhat discredited. So this was looking at these electromagnetic signals and saying, well, maybe because water is polar, so it's not charged, but there's a slight charge separation between the ends of the molecules, and so it does behave in strange ways. With electricity, it conducts electricity, it responds to electromagnetic radiation at certain ways. And so this was like, well, maybe this is how homeopathy works. So there's a couple problems with his article. The biggest two are that he doesn't actually really talk about his materials and methods very clearly, and it's not written like a scientific paper at all. It's just like one long narrative versus actually giving the background and the methods and all the things that my poor students are going to have to do here in a couple of weeks. But the article was received on the 3rd of January in 2009. It was revised on the 5th of January in 2009, and it was accepted on the 6th of January in 2009 by a paper that had, or a journal that had just been launched, and of which Montaigne was the primary editor. So this is highly suspect, to say the least, because in a regular journal, in terms of peer review, usually an article is accepted and then it's revised several months later, and then, it's received and then it's revised several months later, and then it's accepted several months after that. So you'll see something that's like sort of submitted in March and finally actually published in October. So this sort of 3-day turnaround between when it's received and when it's actually published is ridiculous, and it's definitely not a high mark in favor of the credibility of the article. There was also a high level of background noise, and when they did some other experiments where they tried to filter out the background noise, they found that they lost the effects. So some scientists have posited that what Montaigne saw was actually just what happens when you're looking so hard for signals that you start seeing signals and noise. And this is a common thing that can happen if you get a little too myopic about your ideas. And his results, even if they're true, which I'm not sure they are, they don't really support homeopathy, because in his highest dilutions, there were still molecules of the DNA. He did not go past Avogadro's limit. And he observed that there were no effects in low dilutions of his molecules, and that there were observable effects at some of the higher dilutions, but the effect vanished at the highest dilution. So his highest dilutions did not have any effect at all. And the effect did not grow progressively stronger as the dilution was progressively higher. So it didn't correspond to the principle that homeopaths say, which is the higher the dilution, the stronger the remedy. So it did not provide any evidence for that. In fact, provided evidence against that. And then the last problem was the effects only lasted up to 48 hours. And for a homeopathic remedy, the remedies are basically, if you look at any kind of website that talks about them, they're not supposed to expire. They're supposed to be good forever. So you could, in the words of one homeopathic practitioner, you can pass down the remedies that you don't use in your kit to your grandchildren, and they'll still be effective. Well, if this is how they're working, then no, actually they won't. And the other big problem with the study was that while it claimed that they had detected similar electromagnetic spectrum frequencies in numerous other samples, they did not cite or publish any of that data. So when you do that in a scientific paper, it's highly suspect. You can't just make a claim and not have a reference for it. This was another problem I found with that Merkel article I was reading earlier today, where there's some really fantastic claims that were made, and there was not a single footnote for them. So how am I supposed to determine whether this is actually accurate or not? So there's just some huge problems with that study. And then he went on and published some other things that were questionable, but I feel like we've already kind of dealt sufficiently with his thing, sure. Except that also the fact that he's talking about low frequency electromagnetic radiation. And one of his critics, basically pointed out to him, look, if you're talking about these low frequency waves, which means you're going to have a longer wavelength. So if you have high frequency, you have shorter wavelength, there's shorter distance between the waves. If you have low frequency, there's a longer wavelength. The likelihood of these long frequency, wavelengths even hitting the individual molecules of water is kind of equivalent to expecting an aircraft to hit a specific ant while it's landing in a terminal. You just don't have the space that you have is just not, it's not equivalent to the size of the molecule that you're dealing with. So it's pretty silly, honestly. And then
we're running up a little bit into the clock. Could you?
Oh, sure. Well, you were worried this morning I wouldn't have an hour, Father.
Could you perhaps, people might say, well, you're not mentioning the importance of the vigorous shaking, or that's really what's releasing
the succussion,
energy.
Right?
Succussion, right?
Succussion.
Succussion. It's like
something like that.
You concussed. Succussion. The violent sort of shaking and using of this leather Bible, which, leather-bound Bible, which is what Hahnemann sort of wanted to bang his sort of mixtures with. What are they saying there? And is it scientifically feasible that violent shaking will somehow spiritualize or energize or dynamize this particular solution?
Right. So in the experiments I just talked about, they did violently shake the dilutions in between, and that's I think that's thought to be necessary because there's a gentleman, his name is Martin Chaplin. He's looked at micro arrangements that occur in water, and some people call them liquid crystals, but I haven't seen any evidence of water actually forming liquid crystals. Other things do form liquid crystals, but water can form sort of these transitory, short-lived arrangements of water molecules that have some sort of structure to them. And he seems to think, so his name is Martin Chaplin. He seems to think that he's published a lot of things that these micro structures, particularly when they form icosahedral clusters of about 280 water molecules, that these somehow explain the anomalous behavior of water under certain conditions, and that somehow, if water can form these structures, then it somehow makes sense that if we're successing it, if we're banging it against these things, then that's giving it the energy it needs for those molecules to form those association and somehow, imprint the molecule on them. And the explanation for like exactly, I mean, I don't see any real explanation for like a number of times that this would have to happen, even though I'm pretty sure that's well, I know it's a part of what Hahnemann proposes, like a certain number of, you have to hit it a certain number of times and dilute it a certain number of times, and only certain kinds of dilutions are actually effective. And it was like 6, 12, and 30, and 200 or something like that. Maybe a few other ones, but that reliance on a number of times is ritualistic, not scientific. And even the reliance on the shaking, I think, is ritualistic and not scientific. Although there are people that claim that that's what gives the molecules the energy that they need to form these microstructures. But if these microstructures are forming based on the hydrogen bonding of water, they're transient things. They last for trillionth of a second. They're not, even if water can form these interesting chains and loops and icosahedrons, transiently, that's not really related to homeopathy, because you would have to have some sort of permanence to the imprinting of the water. And I'm just not seeing evidence for that, succession or no succession. So I can't give you a logical reason for why that would be necessary. I mean, other than you mentioned, if you're trying to remember something, you sort of.
We were mentioning it today, sometimes you have to shake your memories. You have to sort of your head in order to remember what you forgot. Because my, water memory, father's memory. So.
Well, and I think maybe also it we talked a little bit about, why doesn't, if water has a memory, why doesn't water remember everything? Why doesn't the water remember, the water in my glass here has not, just come straight out of my tap to me, not touching anything in between. And I do filter my water, so, it doesn't have chlorine in it, but, it's got all kinds of other things in it. There's other minerals that have touched it. It's been in other people's bodies, maybe even dinosaurs. It's kind of a cool thought. So why doesn't it remember the dinosaur? Why doesn't it remember, a lead molecule that it encountered somewhere along the way? Why doesn't it remember those things? And the strict homeopaths will say, well, it's because it hasn't been succussed. That somehow isn't a very important part of imprinting this memory on the water. So you can't talk about water having a memory unless you have that succession for it. So that's why you bang your head when you can't remember.
That's succuss yourself there. So, Pam, would you want to maybe just give a like a summary, and maybe your concern about this for people who are looking for? We talked about it last time. People want more natural remedies. They want to stay away from a lot of these big pharma solutions, which don't necessarily treat the whole person or concern themselves with the whole person. But, what would you say about homeopathy? Is that like a false sort of way to sort of solve this dilemma that we're in?
Yeah, I would say it is. Because even in terms of it actually working, there's a number of instances where it doesn't actually work. Homeopaths will tell you that, like, it's really kind of a rare thing for somebody to just sort of be able to walk into the grocery store or pick up a remedy, and that remedy works for what they're saying. There's homeopaths who earn part of their living by selling their own versions of the materia medica that make it simpler for you to be able to diagnose your symptoms at home. I used to have a homeopathy book myself that and even trying to diagnose your own symptoms at home, there's always like an explanation that's offered for like why it doesn't work. Well, you just picked the wrong remedy, or you touched the pellets, or you didn't put it under your tongue, or you drank water too soon, or you drank caffeine too soon, or you did whatever, or you feel worse because the medicine is working, which is the same thing that we hear about and laugh about because of the vaccines. But people who kind of justify, well, homeopathy works, but it's not really working, in this situation, or it's not really working for this person. It's or it's making them feel worse. We'll say, well, it's because the medicine is working. So it doesn't always work. It's not always effective. And if it is effective, it's not effective through a reasonable biological basis. It's like we talked about, it's either working, at best it's working through the placebo effect, and so you've got a positive expectation of getting better, and you do, or it's just not working at all. And, you have regression to the mean where, you seek treatment when you're feeling bad. And when you're feeling your worst, you're more likely to get better. And so you feel like you got better. And it really is just a post hoc, ergo propter hoc fallacy, like I took the pill and then I got better, but really I was getting better anyway. Or it's just that you're not exposing yourself to alcohol or caffeine or whatever. But worst case, it is working through an occult vital force. And, we talked a little bit last time about, just a few of my own experiences with the effects of occult vital forces. And if this is how it's working, this is why I care. Because if it's just quackery, a fool and his money are soon parted. And I'm sorry that you were parted, but you can't take money with you anyway. But if we're talking about people's souls, it's a much bigger deal. And that's why I'm willing to do this, because I know that what I'm saying is not popular. What I'm saying is something that people can have. People have very deep attachments to homeopathy. As we were talking about earlier, if you try to show somebody that something they're attached to is not good for them, like trying to explain to somebody that rock music is bad for you, or the Lord of the Rings is bad for you, or that evolution isn't true. Any of these things, people have these sort of entrenched attachments to either the way that they have been taught or trained, or the way that they think things work, or the things that they just like. And those things are hard to deal with. They don't go towards making me a popular and well-loved person by all. Not that that's my goal necessarily either, but
we appreciate you. And your book, Vaccination, the Catholic Perspective. Maybe there's a homeopathy book coming out in the future, perhaps. So maybe.
Well, we'll see. I don't think it will be backed by the Kolbe Center, unfortunately.
As well received, yes. So,
but
let's ask some questions. We have, if anybody has any questions, please feel free. Someone did write a question, and almost sort of a good observation, really. And this one says, Pam, placebos may sometimes, quote unquote, work, as does, for example, visits with doctors with good bedside manner, etc. That's true.
Mm-hmm.
Possibly due simply to less stress levels. True.
Right.
Stress causes inflammation, and inflammation can be the cause of many diseases.
Right. So, no, we were talking even this morning about, my own experience has been very colored by my ankle injury. And, I can attest that, the first year and 5 months where basically doctors just sort of looked at me, scratched their head and said, I don't know why you have this particular constellation of symptoms. And, you're obviously in pain, but I can't do anything for you. I don't know. I don't know what's wrong. And I can't really give you anything that will help. And so I had to, I was going to say walk out of their office, but I couldn't walk. I had to crutch out of their office with sort of no hope of anything getting better. And it definitely, the experience of having a diagnosis, just the lifting of the mental load of I don't know what's wrong with me. I don't know if I will ever get better. If I get better, when I will get better. That's a huge, that mental game, especially in terms of chronic illness or chronic injury, is huge in terms of health impact. And so if you can do something that alleviates that mental game, that being in your head about your injury all the time, it's not unbelievable or unreasonable at all that would have positive physiological effects just from the reduction of the stress.
Well said. Another question, Pam. Father, this person asks, can the argument be made that while homeopathy was developed by a Freemason and an occultist, what about going to allopathic doctors who are pro-abortion? Pharmaceuticals and vaccines developed by very immoral means, none are clean. So what's the difference? So you have obviously some contact with the more traditional allopathic sort of practitioners, doctors, but a lot of them are pushing vaccines on people that are with tainted sort of backgrounds. And then also they might make referrals for abortion versus the sort of Freemasonic past of homeopathy.
Right. So there's a distinction that has to be made between the origin and the practice, right? So the origin of allopathic medicine is not a cult. It might be incorrect. It might be, unjustifiable, but it's not connected to something directly occult. And you could even make the argument that it's evolutionary, and so like in that way, it's connected to something that's atheist or something like that. But it's not directly influenced by an overarching commitment to Satanism, which is what Freemasonry is. And so like there's a huge distinction that has to be made there. But then if you're talking about vaccination has a very problematic origin. I've talked a lot about that. And that to me is sufficient justification to say that we need to rethink this paradigm. We need to let this go. So I don't see how the two positions are contradictory. They're actually one and the same. If you're looking at the origin of something, you're saying that this originated incorrectly. This is not justifiable based on the current scientific evidence. And when with the connection between vaccines and abortion, you do have a direct, I would say, a direct occult connection there, because I think there's a direct occult connection between abortion, which is effectively child sacrifice, and the occult. And if you're using those things in vaccines, then obviously these are problematic, I would say, for the same reason that homeopathy is. I mean, so I don't really see what question is really being asked, other than kind of an oblique way to say, oh, well, isn't homeopathy okay because allopathy is also bad? No, it's not. And you can't say that something is okay because something else is bad, because you have to look at how is it bad, in what way is it bad, is its origin bad, is its practice bad, or both bad? I don't believe in putting toxins in your body. I don't think we should use mercury fillings in your mouth, or I don't think you should use powerful drugs when natural remedies are reasonable. But that is very different than, or different from, saying that these drugs were developed somehow in connection with someone who claimed that this method was revealed to him by God, and it obviously was not.
Mm.
Is that, I mean, I'm not a theologian here, so this really isn't necessarily my question to answer, but
Sure.
but that would make sense to me.
Mm-hmm. And then someone asks, or just makes a statement, really, the strange esoteric origins of homeopathy seem oddly similar to the origins of AA and the 12-step program. So that's another topic in the future for sure, because there's something there. Because I think to look into the background of some of those founders of AA, I think would be important.
Right. And I know that, it's not impossible for something positive to come from somebody who's not Catholic, for example. Like people who are not Catholic have come up with great discoveries in science. But if you look at people who are actively engaged in occult practices, like Descartes or even Teilhard de Chardin, the fruit is always bad.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Their discoveries are, well, even the guy who invented Mormonism too was Joseph Smith.
Joseph Smith, yes.
Yes. So it's just
by the way, Freemason.
Yes.
Mormonism is Freemasonry.
Right.
It's high-end liturgical Freemasonry. Their inner sanctums are like Freemasonic sort of temples of sorts. So, Pam, I want to thank you as always it's just fantastic what you've been able to put together, both in regards to vaccines as well, the COVID vaccine in particular, but also homeopathic sort of practice and some concerns that you have about it, and that we should all have about it. I really think, I do think that. So any final word that you want to give besides don't?
Sure. I'd like to close, if I may, with 3 quick quotations. The first is from, and I'm probably going to mispronounce his name, but George Fictulis's Homeopathy, Medicine for the New Man. He begins a chapter titled Coming of the New Age. In his last chapter is Promise for the New Age. And he says, the real purpose of homeopathy is to open the higher centers or the brain for spiritual and celestial influx. The purpose is to become one with yourself, one with the universe through your mind. Another homeopath, James T. Ken, in The Science and Art of Homeopathy, says a truly homeopathic doctor is initiated into this transcendental spiritualist world. He must have knowledge of the 4 states of matter, the solid, liquid, gaseous, and radiant states. And so it's not, these are not old, these are current homeopaths saying, you know, the spiritual nature of this thing. And then finally, Father Larry Hogan, who's the chief exorcist of the Archdiocese of Vienna, when he was answering questions raised concerning the nature of homeopathy, simply said that homeopathy is magic, and he would not recommend anyone to use it.